The Roman Empire did not fall in a single night of fire and iron. It unraveled slowly. And one of the threads that pulled it apart was silk. Not swords, not plagues, not even invading armies, at least not at first. It began with fabric. By the 1st century A.D., Roman elites had developed a hunger for something that did not grow in Italy, did not emerge from Egypt, and could not be woven in Gaul. It came from the East, from lands so distant they felt almost mythical. China. The Romans called it Serica, the land of silk. And silk was unlike anything the Mediterranean world had ever seen. It shimmered. It flowed like water. It caught sunlight and held it. When a Roman senator's wife entered a banquet draped in translucent silk, the entire room knew what it meant. Power, wealth, distance conquered. Silk was not just cloth. It was a signal, and Rome became addicted to the signal. In the early Republic, Roman values emphasized austerity. Wool was respectable. Linen was acceptable, extravagance was suspect, but the empire changed everything. As Rome expanded, wealth poured in from conquered territories, gold from Spain, grain from Egypt, taxes from Gaul, tribute from Asia Minor. The Roman elite did not merely consume this wealth, they competed with it. Public games became larger, villas grew more ornate, clothing grew more extravagant, and silk became the ultimate status marker. The Senate even tried to ban it. In A.D. 16, the Roman Senate debated restricting silk garments for men, arguing they were immoral and effeminate. The fabric was too transparent, too foreign, too excessive. But moral outrage could not overpower desire. Demand only grew. And here is where the economic danger begins, because Rome did not produce silk, not even close. Silk did not travel directly from China to Rome. It passed through hands, many hands. The Silk Road was not one road. It was a web of caravan routes stretching across Central Asia. Chinese traders handed silk to intermediaries in the Tarim Basin. Sogdian merchants moved it westward. Indian traders exchanged goods along maritime routes. Parthians and later Sassanid Persians controlled the crucial bottleneck between East and West. Each exchange increased the price. Each middleman added a premium. By the time silk reached Roman Syria or Egypt, its cost had multiplied many times over. Pliny the Elder complained in the 1st century that Rome was spending 100 million sesterces annually on luxuries from the East, silk chief among them. He wrote with alarm, "So dearly do we pay for our luxury and our women." He was not exaggerating for poetry. He was observing a financial hemorrhage. Here is the critical imbalance. Rome exported very little that China or India wanted. Roman glassware found some markets. Wine traveled east in limited quantities. But precious metals were the real currency. Gold, silver, bullion, coins. Rome paid for silk in hard metal, and those metals did not come back. They flowed eastward in a steady, irreversible stream. Imagine an empire at the center of a vast economy. Now imagine that empire purchasing vast quantities of goods, but selling almost nothing in return. The result is simple: trade deficit. But this was not a modern credit-based imbalance. This was physical gold leaving the imperial system. Once gone, it did not circulate in Roman markets again. It did not pay Roman soldiers. It did not fund aqueduct repairs. It did not stabilize coinage. It vanished into foreign treasuries. Over decades, then centuries, this became catastrophic. By the 2nd century, silk was often literally worth its weight in gold. That is not metaphor. A pound of silk could equal a pound of precious metal, and Rome bought enormous quantities, not just for clothing. Silk adorned banners, furniture, cushions. ceremonial robes. Emperors wore it. Generals displayed it. The church would later incorporate it into vestments. The more unstable the empire became, the more desperately elites clung to symbols of permanence and status. Silk became armor against decline, which meant demand increased precisely when the treasury could least afford it. At first, the Roman Empire could absorb the drain. Its conquests were still expanding. New provinces meant new tax revenue. War plunder replenished gold reserves. But by the late 2nd century, expansion stalled. The empire reached its territorial limits. No more massive influxes of new treasure. Only maintenance, defense, infrastructure, administration, and silk. The balance began to shift. More gold leaving, less gold arriving, and unlike modern economies, Rome could not simply print wealth into existence. Coinage was metal. If you lacked gold, you had two options. 1, stop spending. 2, debase the currency. Rome chose the second. But that decision comes later. First, we must understand the choke point, because Rome's silk addiction would have been dangerous enough on its own. But it became lethal when another empire realized it controlled the gate. In the east, between Rome and China, a new power was rising, the Sassanid Empire, and it understood something Rome did not want to admit. Whoever controlled the silk routes controlled Rome's bleeding treasury. The Persians did not need to conquer Rome. They only needed to tax its desire, and they did so brilliantly. But before we watch the Persian chokehold tighten, we must look closer at the Roman elite, the consumers whose insatiable appetite set this disaster in motion. Because empires rarely collapse from invasion alone. They collapse from within, and sometimes collapse begins with something as soft as silk. By the 2nd century, Rome was no longer a conquering republic fueled by disciplined austerity. It was a consumer empire. And nowhere was that transformation more visible than in its appetite for Eastern luxuries. Silk was not a marginal indulgence enjoyed by a few eccentric aristocrats. It had become a structural economic force. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century A.D., estimated that Rome was losing roughly 100 million sesterces annually to luxury imports from India, Arabia, and China. That figure is staggering when placed in context. So the annual pay for a Roman legionary under Augustus was around 900 sesterces. 100 million sesterces represented the yearly salaries of over 110,000 soldiers. In other words, Rome was exporting the equivalent cost of multiple full legions every single year simply to clothe its elite in shimmering foreign fabric. This was not a one-year anomaly. It was a persistent structural imbalance. Silk entered the empire primarily through two major routes. The overland Silk Road, stretching from Han China across Central Asia, fed into Parthian and later Sassanid-controlled territories. The maritime route connected Chinese and Indian ports to the Red Sea, where Roman merchants transported goods north through Egypt and into the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from Berenike and Myos Hormos, Roman ports on the Red Sea, confirms the scale of Indo-Roman trade. Roman coins have been found in large quantities in southern India, particularly in Tamil Nadu, and demonstrating that bullion flowed outward in payment. What did Rome export in return? Some Mediterranean wine, olive oil, glassware, and coral? But these goods did not match the value of silk, spices, and precious stones flowing westward. The imbalance was persistent and undeniable. The Roman monetary system relied on precious metals. Gold auri and silver denarii were not symbolic currency backed by confidence alone. They were literal stores of value. When bullion left the empire, it reduced the metallic basis upon which the entire economy rested. For much of the 1st and 2nd centuries, conquest masked this problem. Gold from Dacia under Trajan, for example, temporarily replenished reserves. But once expansion slowed after the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the structural deficit became visible. By the early 3rd century, the empire faced mounting military pressures along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Maintaining the army consumed an ever larger portion of the imperial budget. Soldiers had to be paid in coin, not promises. Yet silver content in the denarius began to decline dramatically. Under Augustus, the denarius was about 95% silver. By the time of Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century, it had fallen to roughly 50%. Under Caracalla and his successors, the silver content plunged further. By the 260s, during the crisis of the 3rd century, the Antoninianus contained as little as 5% silver. Debasement was not an abstract policy choice. It was a response to physical scarcity. The empire needed coinage to function, but the metal base was shrinking. Part of that contraction was due to internal instability and military overspending, but the long-term outflow of bullion to the east compounded the crisis. The silk trade did not single-handedly destroy the currency, but it eroded the reserve foundation over generations. Meanwhile, Rome's eastern rival understood the leverage it possessed. The Sassanid Empire, which replaced the Parthians in 224 AD, controlled the crucial land corridors through which silk traveled west. Persian merchants acted as intermediaries, purchasing silk from Central Asian traders and selling it onward at marked-up prices. Rome and Persia were geopolitical adversaries, yet Rome depended on Persian-controlled routes for access to its most coveted luxury good. Persia could not easily conquer Rome outright, but it could profit from Roman consumption. When diplomatic tensions rose, trade could be restricted. When wars erupted along the Mesopotamian frontier, silk shipments slowed. Every interruption increased scarcity and drove prices higher. Persian middlemen extracted profits, while Rome's elite paid ever more gold. Roman attempts to bypass this dependency were limited and often unsuccessful. The empire tried to strengthen Red Sea trade routes through Egypt in order to access Indian Ocean commerce directly, avoiding overland Persian tolls. While maritime trade with India flourished to some degree, China remained largely out of reach. The logistical distance was immense, and the technological knowledge required for silk production remained firmly guarded in the East. Sericulture, the process of cultivating silkworms and weaving silk thread, was a closely protected secret in China. The export of silkworm eggs was punishable by death under Chinese law. Rome could buy silk, but it could not produce it. That dependency locked the empire into a one-sided economic relationship. At the same time, cultural demand intensified. Silk was not merely a luxury fabric, it became integrated into Roman social identity. By the late empire, silk garments were used in imperial ceremonies, ecclesiastical vestments, and aristocratic wardrobes. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices in AD 301 lists silk garments among the most expensive regulated goods in the empire. The state attempted to cap prices, a clear sign of runaway inflation and scarcity. Price controls did not solve the underlying problem. As silver and gold supplies dwindled, emperors relied increasingly on taxation in kind. Rather than collecting coin, the state began demanding grain, livestock, and labor. This shift signaled a deeper transformation. A monetized imperial economy was gradually reverting to localized subsistence systems. Urban centers suffered first. Rome's cities depended on long-distance trade networks. When coinage lost reliability and trade routes became unstable, merchants struggled. The Roman middle class of traders, ship owners, and artisans weakened. Economic contraction followed. Meanwhile, the eastern half of the empire, centered on Constantinople after its founding in AD 330, and retained stronger access to eastern trade routes. Geography favored the east. Proximity to Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt allowed the Eastern Empire to manage silk imports more efficiently and tax them more directly. The West, however, grew increasingly dependent on Eastern redistribution. When imperial resources concentrated in Constantinople, gold reserves moved with them. The Western Roman Empire, already strained by barbarian incursions and internal political fragmentation, found itself with fewer financial tools. Paying Federate troops and mercenaries became more difficult. Military loyalty shifted when salaries failed. The silk trade did not operate in isolation from these events. It intersected with monetary debasement, military expenditure, geopolitical rivalry, and administrative reorganization. Over centuries, the persistent outflow of bullion weakened Rome's fiscal spine. By the 4th century, the empire was no longer a unified economic organism. It was bifurcated. The East retained wealth, trade access, and monetary stability. The West inherited vulnerability. And yet, the West still desired silk. Desire does not disappear simply because circumstances change. In fact, scarcity can intensify it. This is the paradox at the heart of Rome's economic decline. Even as gold reserves thinned, even as coinage lost purity, even as infrastructure deteriorated, the symbolic importance of silk increased. It became a marker of continuity in a world that felt unstable. But symbols cannot replace solvency. As the 5th century approached, the West stood financially exposed. Its armies were underpaid, its currency debased, its trade routes fragile. And somewhere beyond Persia, beyond Central Asia, beyond deserts and mountains, lay the secret that could have saved it. A secret guarded under penalty of death. A secret that Constantinople, not Rome, would eventually steal. The center of gravity was about to shift permanently eastward. The West would not recover from it. By the beginning of the 4th century, the Roman Empire had been fundamentally reshaped by crisis. The 3rd century had delivered civil wars, breakaway states, plague, inflation, and relentless pressure along the frontiers. Yet beneath the political chaos, a quieter structural transformation was underway. The center of imperial gravity was shifting eastward, toward the wealthier, more urbanized provinces that had long served as Rome's commercial bridge to Asia. When Constantine founded Constantinople in AD 330 on the site of Byzantium, he was not merely creating a new capital for symbolic reasons. He was repositioning imperial authority closer to the arteries of Eastern trade. The Bosporus Strait controlled access between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Anatolia connected Europe to Asia. Syria and Egypt anchored the routes that linked Rome to the Red Sea and beyond. Constantinople was economically strategic. This mattered enormously for silk. The western provinces, Gaul, Spain, Britain, and North Africa, were productive but increasingly militarized and ruralized. The eastern provinces, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, were commercial engines. Cities, such as Antioch and Alexandria, were vibrant nodes in long-distance trade. When silk arrived from Persia or via maritime routes through the Indian Ocean, it entered an Eastern economic ecosystem that was better positioned to capture its value. In effect, the Eastern Empire could tax silk more efficiently and redistribute it internally, while the Western Empire remained primarily a consumer dependent on Eastern intermediaries. This divergence became more pronounced after AD 395, when the empire was permanently divided between East and West following the death of Theodosius I. Though technically still one empire in theory, in practice there were now two administrations, two courts, and increasingly separate fiscal systems. The East inherited the richest provinces, the West inherited the most exposed frontiers. At precisely the moment when bullion reserves were strained, the Western Empire found itself structurally disadvantaged in the silk economy. Meanwhile, the Sassanid Empire remained a formidable rival. From the 3rd through the 6th centuries, Rome and Persia engaged in intermittent warfare over Armenia and Mesopotamia. These wars were expensive and disruptive. They also reinforced Persia's role as the middleman in silk distribution. Every diplomatic mission to negotiate peace was also indirectly a negotiation over trade stability. Roman envoys occasionally attempted to establish direct contact with China, hoping to bypass Persian control. There are scattered references in Chinese sources to embassies from Da Qin, the Chinese term often associated with Rome. But these contacts were rare, indirect, and largely symbolic. The geographic and political obstacles were immense. Persia sat squarely between the Mediterranean and East Asia, and it had no incentive to facilitate Roman independence in silk procurement. The result was a long-term structural dependency. By the 5th century, the Western Empire was financially brittle. Gold coinage, particularly the solidus introduced by Constantine, remained relatively stable in the East, but the West increasingly struggled to maintain consistent minting. The ability to pay troops was critical. Roman military power rested not only on discipline, but on regular salary. When payments faltered, loyalty faltered. The Visigoths under Alaric famously sacked Rome in AD 410. Yet even before that dramatic moment, there were signs of fiscal strain. In 408, when Alaric demanded payment to withdraw his forces, he requested thousands of pounds of gold and silver. The Senate scrambled to gather the ransom, melting down statues and stripping precious metals from public monuments. This was not an empire flush with reserves. It was an empire improvising. One must understand that by this stage, gold had already been migrating eastward for centuries through trade. While not all of Rome's fiscal crisis can be attributed to silk, the long-term bullion drain limited flexibility. The empire could not conjure metal out of abstraction. Mines in Spain and the Balkans were less productive than in earlier centuries. Conquests had ended. Tribute from new provinces no longer replenished reserves. What remained was taxation and trade. But trade was no longer balanced. Luxury consumption persisted even as infrastructure deteriorated. Silk did not vanish from elite wardrobes during the 5th century. On the contrary, it became increasingly associated with imperial and ecclesiastical authority. Bishops wore silk vestments. Court officials displayed it as a sign of continuity with Rome's past grandeur. The irony was profound. The more precarious the Western Empire became, the more its ruling class clung to symbols of stability imported from beyond its control. Meanwhile, Constantinople grew stronger. The Eastern Empire maintained more stable urban networks and trade corridors. Its tax base was broader and more resilient. When gold flowed east, it increasingly remained there. Constantinople was positioned to capture and retain value, while the West became a peripheral recipient. By the mid-5th century, the Western imperial court had relocated multiple times, settling finally in Ravenna, a defensible but economically limited city. Rome itself was no longer the administrative heart of the West. Its grandeur was symbolic, not structural. In AD 476, when the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, the event was almost anticlimactic. The Western Empire had already hollowed out. Political authority had fragmented. Military power relied heavily on federate troops of non-Roman origin. Urban decline was visible across Gaul and Britain. Long-distance trade had diminished sharply. The Eastern Empire, however, endured. And it endured in part because it remained plugged into the silk economy in a way the West no longer was. Yet even the East resented Persian dominance over silk supply. Constantinople understood that dependence on Sassanid intermediaries limited its autonomy. As long as Persia controlled the overland routes and access to Central Asia, the Byzantine state was vulnerable. The solution would require audacity. It would require espionage. It would require penetrating one of the most closely guarded industrial secrets in the ancient world. For centuries, China had protected the process of sericulture with extreme severity. The export of silkworm eggs or live worms was forbidden. Those who attempted it faced execution. The knowledge of cultivating mulberry trees, raising silkworms, harvesting cocoons, and spinning thread was treated as strategic state property. If Rome, or rather Byzantium, could acquire that knowledge, it could break the Persian chokehold permanently. It would not restore the Western Empire. That chapter was already closing, but it would redefine the economic future of the Mediterranean world. In the 6th century, under Emperor Justinian I, an extraordinary mission unfolded. 2 monks traveled eastward. They would return carrying something small, fragile, and illegal. Inside hollowed bamboo walking sticks. The theft of a biological secret would shift the balance of power. And in doing so, it would confirm what the West had already learned too late. In an interconnected world, control over supply chains can determine the fate of empires. By the middle of the 6th century, the Western Roman Empire had already vanished as a political entity. The year 476 had marked its formal end, but the structural collapse had been unfolding for decades before that. What survived of Rome's imperial legacy was centered in Constantinople, ruled by emperors who considered themselves the legitimate continuation of Roman authority. It was this Eastern Roman, Byzantine state that would finally move to end the centuries-old silk dependency. The Emperor Justinian I, who reigned from 527 to 565, inherited a state that was stronger than the fallen West, but still strategically constrained. Byzantium controlled Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, all economically vibrant regions. It possessed a stable gold currency in the solidus, which had maintained its weight and purity since Constantine's reforms. Yet even this relatively robust state remained dependent on silk imported through Persian intermediaries. The geopolitical situation was delicate. Byzantium and the Sassanid Empire were locked in recurring conflict, particularly over Armenia and Mesopotamia. War disrupted trade routes and inflated silk prices. Peace treaties often included clauses regarding commerce, but Persia's geographic leverage remained intact. As long as the raw material originated in China and passed through territories beyond Byzantine control, Constantinople was vulnerable. Justinian recognized that this was not merely a matter of luxury consumption. Silk was no longer just fabric for aristocrats. It had become integral to statecraft. Imperial court ceremonies relied on silk garments and hangings to project power. Diplomatic gifts often included silk textiles. The church used silk in liturgical vestments, reinforcing the visual authority of Christianity across the empire. Control of silk production would mean control of a symbol that carried political, religious, and economic weight. Sometime around 552, according to the historian Procopius, 2 Nestorian monks arrived in Constantinople with extraordinary information. They had lived in China, referred to as Serinda in Byzantine sources, and claimed to know the secret of silk production. They told Justinian that silk did not grow on trees, as many Romans had long believed, but came from worms that fed on mulberry leaves. This detail alone represented a conceptual breakthrough. For centuries, the Mediterranean world had misunderstood silk's origin. Pliny and other writers described silk as a kind of plant fiber combed from leaves. The biological reality of sericulture had remained hidden. The monks proposed a daring plan. They would return eastward, obtain silkworm eggs, and smuggle them back to Byzantium. The operation was inherently dangerous. Chinese authorities guarded sericulture knowledge zealously. Exporting silkworm eggs was a capital offense. The monks would have to conceal the eggs in a way that evaded inspection across thousands of miles of travel. According to later accounts, they hid the eggs inside hollowed-out bamboo walking sticks, keeping them warm and viable during the journey. Whether every detail of this story is precisely accurate is debated among modern historians. But the outcome is not in question. By the mid-6th century, silkworm cultivation had begun within Byzantine territory. The impact was transformative. For the first time, a Mediterranean power could produce raw silk domestically. Mulberry trees were planted. Workshops were established, particularly in Constantinople and later in cities such as Thebes and Corinth. The Byzantine state quickly recognized the strategic value of this new industry and moved to monopolize it. Silk production was placed under strict imperial control. State-run workshops, known as gynecia, oversaw weaving and distribution. The emperor regulated who could wear certain types of silk, reinforcing hierarchical distinctions. Silk became not just a commodity, but an instrument of imperial policy. The Persian chokehold weakened. Byzantium no longer needed to rely exclusively on imported finished silk. It could produce its own thread and textiles. While trade with the East did not disappear entirely, China and Central Asia still offered varieties and techniques not immediately replicable in Byzantium. The balance shifted decisively. But this triumph came too late for the West. When Justinian secured the secret of sericulture, the Western Roman Empire had been gone for nearly 80 years. The cities of Gaul had shrunk dramatically. Britain had fragmented into post-Roman kingdoms. Italy had endured invasions by Visigoths and Ostrogoths before becoming the battleground of Justinian's own reconquest campaigns. The gold that once flowed westward through Rome's markets was now concentrated in Constantinople. The Eastern Empire used its fiscal stability to fund Justinian's ambitious military campaigns to reclaim Italy and North Africa. Yet even these reconquests strained resources and proved difficult to sustain. The West, meanwhile, had transitioned into a fundamentally different economic reality. Without strong centralized administration and with long-distance trade networks disrupted, many regions reverted to localized agrarian systems. Coin circulation declined sharply in some former Western provinces. Archaeological evidence from post-Roman Britain, for example, shows a near disappearance of coin use in the 5th and 6th centuries. Barter and in-kind exchange replaced monetized markets. The silk monopoly that Byzantium established ensured that the East would dominate Mediterranean luxury production for centuries. Byzantine silk became renowned across Europe and the Islamic world. It would eventually be transmitted further west through trade and conquest, particularly after the Arab expansions of the 7th century and later during the Norman and Italian mercantile revivals. But the structural divergence between East and West had already been sealed. The Western Empire's long-term bullion drain had limited its fiscal resilience. Its inability to control or replicate silk production symbolized a broader loss of economic leverage. When Constantinople acquired the means of production, it consolidated power in a way Rome never had. In effect, the center of gravity of the Roman world had shifted permanently eastward. Silk was no longer a one-way drain of gold. It had become a state-controlled asset within the Byzantine system. The East could now generate value rather than merely export metal. The West had missed its chance. The consequences were not instantaneous, but they were enduring. The economic integration that once linked Britain to Syria, Spain to Egypt, gradually fragmented. Urban life contracted. Long-distance trade diminished. Regional economies became more self-contained. The medieval world was emerging. And at its foundation lay a lesson both ancient and modern. When an empire becomes structurally dependent on a foreign-controlled supply chain, especially one tied to prestige and political symbolism, it risks more than inflation. It risks losing the very mechanisms that sustain its power. The story of silk did not cause Rome's fall alone, but it illuminated a vulnerability that over centuries proved fatal in the West and transformative in the East. In the next phase, we must examine what the Western collapse looked like on the ground, how infrastructure decayed, how cities emptied, how soldiers went unpaid, and how economic fragility translated into political disintegration. Because bankruptcy, in an imperial context, is not declared in a courtroom, it is revealed in abandoned forums and silent roads. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was not yet a ruin, but it was unmistakably strained. The symptoms of fiscal exhaustion were visible in places where earlier generations would have seen only confidence and abundance. Roads that once carried tax revenues and trade caravans began to deteriorate. Aqueduct systems, marvels of engineering that required constant maintenance, fell into disrepair in some regions. Public buildings were no longer restored with the same frequency or ambition. These were not dramatic collapses, they were incremental withdrawals. At the heart of the strain was money. The Roman state functioned through a complex web of taxation, military payroll, and long-distance trade. Gold and silver coinage lubricated this system. When bullion reserves diminished and coinage was debased over the course of the 3rd century, the consequences rippled outward. Inflation eroded purchasing power. Soldiers demanded higher pay to compensate for reduced silver content in their coins. Provincial administrators struggled to collect taxes in reliable currency. By the time of the Western Empire's final century, emperors increasingly relied on payments in kind. Instead of collecting gold, they collected grain, livestock, and raw materials. While this kept the army provisioned in the short term, it marked a fundamental shift away from a monetized economy. Trade thrives on liquidity. When liquidity shrinks, markets shrink with it. Urban centers were especially vulnerable. Rome, once a city of over 1 million inhabitants in the early imperial period, had already declined significantly by the 5th century. Its population likely fell to perhaps 400,000 or fewer by the time of Alaric's sack in 410. Other cities across Gaul and Britain contracted even more dramatically. Archaeological evidence reveals reduced construction activity, fewer imported goods, and the abandonment of some urban districts. Merchants and artisans, who depended on stable currency and long-distance exchange, found fewer opportunities. The middle stratum of Roman urban society weakened. Wealth concentrated in the hands of large landowners who could sustain themselves through agricultural estates. These estates, or latifundia, increasingly functioned as semi-autonomous units, producing food and basic goods for local consumption rather than relying on distant markets. The silk trade had played a subtle but important role in sustaining the earlier urban economy. Luxury imports created demand for high-value exchange. They encouraged the circulation of gold. They linked Mediterranean ports to inland markets. When bullion drained eastward and silk production remained beyond Western control, the West became progressively less integrated into the global trade network. The military dimension of this shift cannot be overstated. The Roman army was not a volunteer militia, it was a professional force requiring regular salary. Under Diocletian and Constantine, reforms had increased the size and complexity of the military apparatus. Frontier troops, mobile field armies, and administrative staff all required compensation. When coinage lost reliability and gold became scarce, paying troops became more difficult. In the 4th and 5th centuries, the Western Empire increasingly relied on federate agreements with Germanic tribes. Groups such as the Visigoths were settled within imperial territory in exchange for military service. These arrangements were often paid not purely in coin, but in land rights and food supplies. This altered the balance of power. Loyalty became contingent and negotiated rather than absolute. The sack of Rome in 410 was symbolically devastating, but it was also economically revealing. When Alaric demanded ransom, he asked not only for gold and silver, but also for silk garments and pepper. The inclusion of silk in the ransom list underscores its continued symbolic and material value. Yet, the fact that Rome had to melt down statues and strip precious metals from temples to meet these demands demonstrates how thin its reserves had become. The empire's fiscal vulnerability was compounded by geopolitical fragmentation. Britain had effectively slipped from Roman control by the early 5th century. Large portions of Gaul were contested. North Africa, a crucial grain supplier, was lost to the Vandals in 439 when they captured Carthage. This was a catastrophic blow. African provinces had been among the most prosperous and reliable sources of revenue for the Western treasury. With Africa gone, the Western Empire lost not only grain, but also a major tax base. Gold reserves dwindled further. The ability to fund military campaigns against internal usurpers and external threats diminished. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire remained comparatively stable. Its control of Egypt ensured a steady grain supply. Its access to silk production after Justinian's initiative would later reinforce its economic resilience. Constantinople's strategic position allowed it to tax trade flowing between the Mediterranean and Black Sea. The East maintained stronger fiscal institutions and a more reliable currency. The West, by contrast, entered a downward spiral as coinage grew scarce. Barter and localized exchange became more common. In some regions of post-Roman Britain, coins virtually disappeared from circulation. Trade became regional rather than imperial. Infrastructure built for a unified Mediterranean economy no longer had the economic density to sustain it. Silk's role in this transformation was not as a singular cause, but as an accelerant. For centuries, the Western Empire had allowed precious metal to flow outward in exchange for a luxury it could not produce. When territorial expansion ended and mining output slowed, the cumulative drain reduced fiscal flexibility. Debasement attempted to compensate, but confidence in currency declined. By the time the final Western emperor was deposed in 476, the empire had already transitioned into something else. Germanic kings ruled former Roman territories but often retained aspects of Roman administration. Yet the scale of economic integration that once characterized the Mediterranean world had fractured. The disappearance of reliable gold coinage in many Western regions marked a symbolic end to Roman economic hegemony. The global trade networks that once connected Britain to India contracted. Silk did not vanish from Europe entirely, but it became rarer and more tightly controlled, often arriving through Byzantine or later Islamic intermediaries. What replaced the imperial system was not immediate chaos, but Gradual localization. Manorial estates became the core economic units. Production focused on subsistence and regional exchange. Political authority fragmented into smaller kingdoms and duchies. The Western Roman Empire had not collapsed in a single cataclysm. It had eroded. Its treasury had thinned. Its trade networks had weakened. Its army had grown dependent on negotiated loyalties. In this context, the long-term silk drain appears less as an isolated curiosity and more as a revealing symptom. It exemplified how an empire that dominated the Mediterranean could still be structurally dependent on distant suppliers beyond its control. When that dependency intersected with military overextension, political instability, and declining bullion reserves, the result was not immediate ruin, but irreversible transformation. The world that followed would be more fragmented, more rural, and less globally integrated. The age of imperial silk had given way to the age of local grain. When the Western Roman Empire finally dissolved in the late 5th century, there was no formal declaration of bankruptcy, no imperial ledger closed with a final entry in red ink. Instead, insolvency revealed itself in subtler ways, in unpaid soldiers, in shrinking cities, in the quiet disappearance of coin from everyday life. The economic bloodstream of the West had thinned over generations, and by the time political authority collapsed, the fiscal foundation had already eroded. To understand how deeply the economy had fractured, one must look at currency itself. Under Constantine in the early 4th century, the gold solidus had been introduced as a stable, high-purity coin weighing roughly 4.5 grams of gold. It became the backbone of imperial finance and remained remarkably consistent in the Eastern Empire for centuries. But while the East maintained monetary discipline, the West struggled to preserve similar stability. The solidus circulated in the western provinces, yet the gold supply underpinning it increasingly flowed toward Constantinople and beyond. By the 5th century, Western mints produced fewer gold issues, and silver coinage had become erratic. Bronze coins, used for everyday transactions, declined in both quality and quantity. Archaeological excavations in former Western provinces show a marked reduction in coin finds after the mid-5th century. In Britain, coin circulation virtually ceased after around 410. In Gaul and parts of Spain, the pattern is similar. Fewer coins, less uniform minting, and a general contraction of monetized exchange. This was not simply a technical matter of currency reform. It reflected a deeper structural retreat from long-distance commerce. Trade depends on trust in exchange mediums. When coins lose metal content or become scarce, markets shrink accordingly. The silk trade had symbolized Rome's integration into a transcontinental network stretching to East Asia. But as Western fiscal power diminished, that network no longer functioned as it once had. Silk continued to arrive in Europe, but increasingly through Byzantine channels. The West was no longer a primary actor in global trade. It became a peripheral consumer within a system dominated by Constantinople and, soon after, rising Islamic powers. Urban decline accelerated this transition. In the height of the empire, cities such as Trier, Arles, and Milan had been administrative and commercial hubs. They housed imperial courts, tax bureaus, and trading guilds. By the late 5th century, many urban centers had contracted dramatically. Public baths fell into disrepair. Amphitheaters were abandoned or repurposed as fortifications. Public building projects became rare. Without robust trade flows and reliable taxation, municipal governments could not sustain the infrastructure that had once defined Roman civilization. At the same time, land ownership patterns shifted. Large estates grew more self-sufficient, producing grain, livestock, textiles, and tools internally rather than relying on distant markets. Tenant farmers and colony became increasingly bound to the land. This was not yet full medieval serfdom, but the direction was clear. Economic life was localizing. The military consequences of this transformation were profound. In earlier centuries, Rome had paid its legions in reliable coin drawn from a vast imperial treasury. By the 5th century, Western emperors relied heavily on Federate troops. Germanic groups settled within imperial borders who provided military service in exchange for land and a share of tax revenues. These arrangements were pragmatic but unstable. When payments faltered or political alliances shifted, loyalty evaporated. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 by Odoacer, a Germanic military leader, illustrates this new reality. Odoacer did not destroy the imperial system through overwhelming conquest. He simply removed an emperor whose authority had become largely symbolic. The Western court lacked the fiscal and military strength to resist effectively. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, maintained its administrative machinery. Its gold solidus remained trusted from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Its access to silk production after Justinian's intervention gave it leverage not only economically, but diplomatically. Byzantine silk textiles became prized exports and political gifts, reinforcing the empire's prestige. In effect, the economic divergence between East and West became self-reinforcing. The West's bullion reserves had thinned over centuries of trade imbalance and internal instability. Its urban networks had weakened. Its military payroll system had fractured. When political authority finally collapsed, it did so on already hollow ground. The shift toward an agrarian economy was not instantaneous, nor was it uniform across all regions. Italy retained pockets of urban continuity. Southern Gaul preserved some trade connections, but the scale of integration that had once defined the Roman Mediterranean was gone. In the early Middle Ages, Europe became a patchwork of kingdoms. Exchange persisted, but it was regional. Long-distance luxury trade did not vanish entirely, but it became rarer and more mediated. Byzantine and later Islamic merchants would dominate silk distribution into Western Europe. The transformation was not merely economic, it reshaped culture and governance. Without abundant coinage and expansive trade, rulers relied more heavily on land grants than salaries. Political power became tied to control of territory rather than centralized fiscal administration. Looking back across the centuries, the silk drain appears as one thread in a larger tapestry of decline. It did not single-handedly bankrupt the Western Roman Empire, but it exemplified a structural vulnerability, dependence on a foreign-controlled luxury supply chain that siphoned precious metals outward without equivalent return. When Rome's conquests slowed and new sources of bullion ceased to flow in, the imbalance became unsustainable. Debasement postponed crisis but did not resolve it. Military pressures exposed fiscal weakness, trade contraction accelerated urban decline, and when the West finally fractured, it did so in a world that had already shifted its economic center eastward. The fabric that once symbolized Roman dominance had instead highlighted its dependency. Silk had shimmered in imperial courts, but behind its brilliance lay a slow and steady outflow of wealth that the Western treasury could never fully recover. The empire did not collapse because of a single piece of cloth, but in chasing that cloth across continents, it revealed the limits of its own power. If the collapse of the Western Roman Empire appears, at first glance, to be the story of barbarian invasions and political incompetence, the economic layer beneath it tells a quieter but equally decisive story. And the West did not simply lose battles, it lost leverage, and that loss of leverage had been accumulating for centuries through patterns of trade that drained its metallic wealth while enriching competitors and intermediaries. To grasp the scale of the shift, consider what Rome had once been. In the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D., the Roman Empire accounted for perhaps 1/4 of the world's economic output. Its population likely exceeded 60 million people. Its road network stretched for over 80,000 kilometers. Mediterranean trade linked Spain to Syria, North Africa to Gaul, Britain to Egypt. Coinage flowed reliably across these distances. A merchant in Antioch could transact with a counterpart in Carthage using standardized currency recognized across the empire. This integration required metal. Gold and silver coins were the bloodstream of this system. They enabled taxation, military payrolls, infrastructure contracts, and long-distance exchange. Without reliable bullion, the machinery of empire faltered. The silk trade exemplified how external demand could quietly erode that metallic foundation. Roman elites did not merely purchase silk occasionally, they institutionalized it within imperial ceremony. Silk garments became embedded in court ritual and ecclesiastical display. The demand was steady, elite-driven, and largely immune to moral legislation. Over time, that demand translated into a persistent outflow of gold eastward. Even if we take Pliny's estimate of 100 million sesterces per year as rhetorical exaggeration, the archaeological evidence of Roman coins found in India and beyond confirms significant bullion transfer. Thousands of Roman auri and denarii have been unearthed in South Indian hoards, particularly from the 1st and 2nd centuries. These coins did not circulate back to Rome. While early imperial expansion masked the imbalance, the end of large-scale conquest removed the safety valve. By the 3rd century, Rome faced mounting military costs without new plunder to offset trade deficits. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284, exposed this fragility. Rapid turnover of emperors, civil wars, invasions, and plague compounded fiscal stress. Debasement accelerated. The silver content of coinage plummeted. Inflation surged. Confidence in currency weakened. Although reforms under Diocletian and Constantine restored some stability, they could not fully reverse structural shifts. Constantine's gold solidus provided a reliable high-value currency, but the overall volume of precious metal available to the western provinces was constrained. Increasingly, gold accumulated in the east. This divergence became decisive after the permanent division of the empire in 395. The Eastern Empire retained the wealthiest provinces, Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and the key trade arteries linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and Silk Road. The Western Empire controlled regions that were agriculturally productive but less commercially central. When gold flowed east through trade or taxation, it increasingly stayed there. By the 5th century, the West faced an unfavorable equation: high military expenditure, reduced tax base, declining urban commerce, and limited bullion reserves. North Africa's loss to the Vandals in 439 was particularly damaging. Carthage had been one of the empire's richest cities and a critical supplier of grain and revenue. Its loss severely undercut Western fiscal capacity. In this context, silk's story is illustrative. The West continued to desire silk goods, but production remained outside its control. Byzantine acquisition of sericulture in the 6th century consolidated Eastern dominance over the luxury textile market. The West, fragmented into successor kingdoms, became dependent on imports mediated through Constantinople or later Islamic networks. The economic center of gravity had shifted permanently. This shift had profound implications for the structure of European society. Without abundant coinage and integrated trade, Western regions became more localized. Political authority was tied increasingly to land rather than liquid wealth. Land grants replaced salaried offices. All warriors were compensated with estates instead of coin. Manorialism emerged not from ideological preference, but from economic necessity. Large estates organized agricultural production and provided protection in a world where centralized fiscal systems had weakened. Peasants became bound to the land in exchange for security and access to resources. Exchange occurred locally, often through barter or limited silver coinage. The contrast with the Eastern Empire was stark. And Constantinople remained a cosmopolitan metropolis, with a population that may have exceeded 500,000 at its height. Its markets bustled with goods from the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and beyond. Byzantine silk workshops supplied imperial and foreign courts. The gold solidus became the dominant international currency of the early medieval world. In effect, while the West descended into fragmentation, the East leveraged control over key trade goods to maintain coherence. The lesson is not that silk alone bankrupted the Western Empire. Military overextension, political instability, demographic shocks, and external invasions all played critical roles. But silk represents a case study in structural dependency. It reveals how an empire can appear dominant while quietly losing control over vital supply chains and precious resources. Rome's ruling class mistook access for control. They believed that because silk arrived in their markets, they possessed it. In reality, they were paying tribute to distant producers and intermediaries. The gold they spent strengthened foreign treasuries. When crisis struck, that accumulated outflow mattered. An empire built on conquest and integration struggled to adapt to a world where expansion had ended and competition intensified. The West could not produce what it most coveted. It could not easily replace the metal it exported. And it could not sustain the fiscal machinery that had once unified its territories. By the time Byzantine agents smuggled silkworm eggs westward, the Western Empire was beyond rescue. The knowledge came too late to restore the integrated Mediterranean economy of earlier centuries. What remained was a new order. The Mediterranean would still see trade, but it would be mediated by different powers. The silk that once symbolized Roman supremacy would now reinforce Byzantine prestige and later Islamic and Italian commercial networks. The map of Europe had been redrawn not by a single battle, but by cumulative economic shifts. And among those shifts, the quiet, shimmering thread of silk ran from the banquet halls of Rome to the treasuries of Persia and the workshops of Constantinople, carrying gold with it, never to return. By the 6th century, the Western Roman Empire had become a memory, but the economic consequences of its long decline continued to shape Europe. The fragmentation of political authority did not immediately erase Roman institutions. Rather, it altered how wealth, power, and exchange functioned. What had once been a centralized fiscal military state transformed into a mosaic of regional economies. To understand the magnitude of that transformation, it is useful to compare two systems, the high imperial Roman economy and the early medieval order that followed. At its height in the 2nd century, Rome operated a tax system that collected revenue across 3 continents. Provincial taxes were assessed in coin, transported along road and sea networks, and redistributed to fund armies, bureaucracies, and public works. Grain from Egypt fed Rome. Spanish mines supplied silver. Levantine ports facilitated Eastern trade. Silk, spices, Ore and precious stones passed through imperial customs posts, generating tariffs and sustaining merchant communities. By contrast, the early medieval West operated on a far narrower scale. After 476, Germanic successor kingdoms, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, retained aspects of Roman administration but lacked its fiscal depth. Tax collection in coin declined. In some regions, rulers collected tribute primarily in kind. Monetary circulation became uneven. Archaeological surveys across Britain and northern Gaul show a stark reduction in imported ceramics and luxury goods in the late 5th and 6th centuries. Amphorae that once carried Mediterranean olive oil and wine became rare finds. Urban layers thin out. The density of coin deposits drops dramatically. The economic web that had once bound the Mediterranean world together loosened. Silk did not disappear entirely from Western Europe, but it became rarer and more symbolically charged. It was often acquired through diplomatic channels rather than open markets. Byzantine emperors used silk as a tool of foreign policy, granting textiles to barbarian kings to cement alliances. In this way, the very commodity that had once drained Roman gold now reinforced Byzantine leverage. The West had lost not only political unity, but economic initiative. One must be careful not to imagine a complete collapse into isolation. Trade routes continued, especially in the Mediterranean basin. North Africa, under Vandal rule, remained connected to eastern markets. Italian ports maintained some commerce, yet the scale and integration of exchange were diminished. Without a robust gold-based tax system, Western rulers relied more heavily on local production. This shift encouraged the rise of manorial estates as primary economic units. These estates were not merely farms, they were semi-autonomous communities. They produced grain, livestock, textiles, and tools. Peasants worked plots tied to local lords. Surpluses were limited, and long-distance exchange became less central to daily life. The Roman monetary economy had fostered urban specialization. Craftsmen could produce goods for distant markets. Merchants could profit from arbitrage between regions. When coin became scarce and bullion reserves thin, such specialization was harder to sustain. Economic life contracted into smaller geographic circuits. In the East, however, a different trajectory unfolded. After acquiring the secret of sericulture, the Byzantine state cultivated silk production deliberately. Imperial workshops in Constantinople and other cities controlled weaving and distribution. Silk textiles became a significant export, exchanged not only within the Mediterranean, but also with the emerging Islamic caliphates after the 7th century. Byzantine silk production did not make the empire invulnerable. It faced its own military and fiscal crises, but it provided an internal source of high-value goods. Instead of sending gold outward indefinitely, Byzantium could now generate wealth domestically and use silk strategically. This divergence illustrates a broader economic principle. Control over production matters more than access to finished goods. Rome had enjoyed access to silk, but not control over its source. Byzantium secured both. The Western kingdoms, meanwhile, entered a period historians once labeled the Dark Ages, a term now used more cautiously. The early medieval centuries were not devoid of culture or innovation. Monasteries preserved classical texts. Agricultural techniques evolved, political systems adapted, yet the scale of economic connectivity was undeniably reduced compared to the High Empire. The long bullion drain contributed to this reduced scale by limiting fiscal capacity at a critical moment. When the Western Empire faced external pressures and internal instability, it lacked the financial elasticity that earlier centuries of conquest had provided. Gold that had once circulated in Roman markets now bolstered Eastern and Persian treasuries. Trade networks reoriented around new centers of power. The Mediterranean remained active, but it was no longer a Roman lake unified under a single fiscal authority. In the centuries that followed, silk would again play a role in shaping European economies. Italian city-states such as Venice, Genoa, and later Florence would become intermediaries in the silk trade, linking Byzantine and Islamic producers to Western consumers. Eventually, silk production would spread into Italy itself, reducing dependency on Eastern imports. But this renaissance of commerce would not occur until the High Middle Ages, centuries after Rome's fall. The immediate legacy of the Western Empire's economic decline was fragmentation. Authority decentralized, wealth localized. The cohesive fiscal structure that had once sustained legions across continents dissolved into regional systems. In retrospect, silk serves as both symbol and substance. It symbolized Roman opulence and global reach. Yet it also embodied dependency and imbalance. Its shimmer masked a slow extraction of metal that weakened the empire's financial core. When historians trace Rome's fall, they rightly point to military defeats, political corruption, and demographic shocks. But beneath these events lay economic currents that shaped what was possible. The Western Empire did not fall solely because enemies breached its borders. It fell because its fiscal machinery had grown fragile. Silk was not the only factor in that fragility, but it illuminates how luxury consumption, when sustained across centuries without domestic control of production, can transform from status symbol into strategic liability. The Western Roman Empire did not collapse overnight. It thinned, it fragmented, it localized, and in that transformation, the glittering thread of silk ran quietly through the story, connecting distant looms in China to silent forums in Rome. If we step back from the centuries of gradual change and look at the larger pattern, a clearer picture emerges. The Western Roman Empire did not collapse simply because it was attacked. It collapsed because it could no longer afford to function at imperial scale. Armies, roads, ports, bureaucracies, and cities require sustained liquidity. They require predictable revenue. When that revenue weakens over generations, the political structure built upon it becomes brittle. Silk did not create Rome's fiscal problems in isolation, but it magnified a structural weakness: the empire's reliance on precious metals to finance a global trade system in which it increasingly ran a deficit. From the 1st century onward, Roman elites poured bullion eastward in exchange for luxury goods. Archaeological findings confirm the scale of this exchange. Roman gold and silver coins have been discovered in large hoards in India, particularly in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, dating to the early imperial period. These coins did not return west in equivalent quantities. They entered foreign economies and were melted, hoarded, or recirculated locally. The Roman state could tolerate such outflows while conquest supplied new inflows. Under Trajan, the conquest of Dacia in 106 AD reportedly yielded enormous amounts of gold and silver, temporarily strengthening the treasury. But once expansion halted and the empire reached its territorial limits, this replenishment ceased. Trade deficits that had been masked by plunder became visible. By the 3rd century, military expenditures surged. Emperors had to secure loyalty in an age of rapid turnover and civil war. Donatives to troops increased. Fortifications along the Rhine and Danube required investment. Campaigns against Persia consumed resources. When bullion supplies tightened, debasement accelerated. Debasement was effectively a hidden tax. By reducing the silver content of coinage while maintaining face value, the state stretched limited metal supplies. But this eroded confidence. Prices rose as merchants adjusted for reduced intrinsic value. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices in 301 attempted to curb inflation by fixing prices for goods and services, including silk garments. The very existence of such an edict signals economic stress. Yet price controls could not create silver where little remained. As the 4th and 5th centuries unfolded, the Western Empire's fiscal base shrank. Population declines from plague and warfare reduced the tax pool. Loss of territories such as Britain and North Africa further constricted revenue streams. Urban contraction reduced commercial activity. Meanwhile, silk retained its elite allure. Even as resources dwindled, ruling classes continued to consume luxury goods that signaled continuity with Rome's imperial past. The symbolic value of silk intensified precisely when material capacity declined. This disconnect between symbolism and solvency is revealing. Political systems often maintain outward displays of prestige long after economic foundations weaken. Silk robes in imperial courts projected power, but they did not refill depleted treasuries. The Eastern Empire's later acquisition of sericulture illustrates how control over production can reshape strategic outcomes. By producing silk domestically, Byzantium reduced reliance on Persian intermediaries and retained more wealth within its own system. Silk workshops became instruments of statecraft. The empire could reward allies, impress rivals, and sustain court culture without exporting bullion indefinitely. The West never achieved this transition. By the time the secret of silk production reached the Mediterranean, the Western Empire was gone. Its successor kingdoms lacked the centralized administrative capacity to establish monopolistic control over such industries. Economic life in the West adapted to smaller scales. This adaptation was not purely decline, it was transformation. Regional markets persisted. Agricultural innovation occurred. Monasteries became centers of literacy and production. Yet the scope of integration that had once defined the Roman Mediterranean was absent. The broader lesson extends beyond antiquity. Empires function within global systems. When a dominant power becomes dependent on external suppliers for high-value goods, especially goods tied to prestige, governance, or military capability, it exposes itself to leverage. If the flow of value is one-directional, draining precious resources outward, long-term sustainability becomes fragile. Rome's elites may not have perceived silk as strategic vulnerability. They saw it as refinement, as cosmopolitan taste, as evidence of Rome's reach. But economic flows do not respond to aesthetics. Over time, the steady export of gold reduced fiscal flexibility. When crises accumulated, invasions, civil wars, demographic shocks, the Western Empire lacked reserves sufficient to absorb them. Its currency had been diluted, its tax base eroded, its trade networks weakened. The fall of Rome was complex, multi-causal, and gradual, but woven through that complexity is a thread of economic imbalance. Silk's journey from Chinese mulberry groves to Roman banquet halls spanned thousands of miles and numerous intermediaries. At each step, value was added, and gold was transferred. The fabric that shimmered under Mediterranean sunlight carried with it the hidden cost of dependency. When the Western Empire finally dissolved into successor kingdoms, Europe entered a new era. Political authority decentralized, economic systems localized. The Mediterranean would remain active, but no longer unified under a single fiscal regime. In the centuries that followed, new powers would rise: Byzantine emperors, Islamic caliphs, Italian merchants. each navigating the same fundamental reality. Control of supply chains and precious resources shapes geopolitical destiny. Rome learned that lesson slowly and too late in the West. The silk that once symbolized imperial magnificence became, in hindsight, a quiet indicator of structural vulnerability. It did not topple the empire alone, but it illuminated the limits of dominance in a connected world. The map of Europe changed not because silk was soft, but because gold was finite. By the time the Western Roman Empire formally disappeared in 476, the Mediterranean world had already reorganized itself economically. What had once been a unified fiscal organism centered on Rome had split into divergent spheres. The East remained monetized, urban, and commercially connected. The West became increasingly regional, agrarian, and land-based in its power structures. This divergence was not simply political, it was financial. To see how deep the transformation ran, consider taxation. In the High Empire, taxation was assessed in coin across most provinces. Census records tracked households and property. Governors remitted revenue to the central treasury. Coinage flowed outward to pay soldiers and officials. This circulation reinforced economic integration. Even distant provinces were tied into a common fiscal framework. By the late 5th century in the West, that framework had fractured. Successor kingdoms inherited Roman administrative habits, but lacked the bullion reserves to sustain large-scale coin-based taxation. In Merovingian Gaul, gold coins continued to be minted, often imitating Roman solidi, but circulation was thinner and more regionally confined. Silver and bronze issues were inconsistent. Monetary use varied dramatically from one area to another. The decline of consistent coinage meant the decline of fiscal predictability. Without predictable revenue in gold or silver, rulers could not maintain standing professional armies in the Roman sense. Instead, they granted land to warriors in exchange for service. This altered the structure of military loyalty and political authority. Power shifted from centralized treasuries to landed elites. The economic contraction also reshaped trade routes. During the early empire, grain from Egypt fed Rome. Spanish oil amphorae traveled to Britain. Syrian glassware appeared in North African ports. Silk, spices, and luxury goods entered through eastern gateways. The Mediterranean functioned as an integrated commercial basin. After the 5th century in the West, trade did not vanish, but it narrowed. Archaeological layers show fewer imported goods in inland regions. Coastal exchange remained more active, especially in Italy and southern Gaul, but northern territories saw significant contraction. The disappearance of standardized Roman amphora types in many Western contexts signals the decline of regular large-scale Mediterranean supply chains. Silk, once a recurring import into Western markets, became rarer. When it appeared, it often did so as diplomatic gifts or through elite exchange networks rather than broad commercial circulation. Byzantine silk production strengthened Constantinople's role as gatekeeper. Western rulers who wished to acquire luxury textiles increasingly relied on Eastern connections. This reliance reinforced the East's relative strength. The Byzantine Empire, though beset by its own wars and plagues, retained a centralized fiscal system supported by gold solidi that remained trusted across Eurasia. Its ability to produce silk domestically after the 6th century gave it a high-value export commodity. Silk workshops in Constantinople were tightly regulated, and certain patterns were reserved for imperial use, reinforcing hierarchy and prestige. In effect, Byzantium internalized what Rome had once externalized. Instead of exporting gold to purchase finished silk, it controlled production and retained value within its borders. The Western successor states did not possess this capacity. Their economies were structured around land. Agricultural output determined wealth. Political authority derived from control of estates and local networks. Coinage became a supplement rather than the foundation of governance. This shift had cultural consequences as well. Urban life diminished in scale. Literacy became concentrated in ecclesiastical institutions rather than widespread bureaucratic administration. Infrastructure maintenance declined without centralized funding. Roads built for imperial commerce fell into disrepair in some regions, further inhibiting trade. It would take centuries for Western Europe to rebuild large-scale commercial networks. Only in the High Middle Ages, with the rise of Italian maritime republics and renewed Mediterranean trade, would long-distance luxury exchange regain intensity. Even then, silk production increasingly shifted into Europe itself, particularly in Italy and later in France, reducing dependency on Eastern imports. Looking back across this arc, the silk trade serves as a case study in how consumption patterns intersect with structural economics. Rome's appetite for silk was not irrational in isolation. Luxury consumption is common in prosperous societies. But when that consumption is sustained through persistent trade imbalance, paid for with finite bullion, it can quietly undermine fiscal stability. The Western Roman Empire faced multiple crises: invasions, political fragmentation, epidemics, and administrative overreach. Yet underlying these shocks was a reduced capacity to respond. Gold reserves were thinner. Coinage had been debased. Trade networks were less resilient. The loss of North Africa to the Vandals removed a critical revenue source. The reliance on Federate troops reflected fiscal constraints. The inability to project sustained military force signaled a weakened treasury. Silk did not cause each of these events, but it was part of the broader pattern of outward bullion flow that limited Rome's flexibility. In economic terms, the empire had allowed a luxury supply chain to become a structural deficit. When new wealth ceased to flow in through conquest, the imbalance became visible. Debasement bought time, but eroded trust. When compounded by geopolitical and demographic pressures, the result was systemic contraction. The map of Europe after 476 bore little resemblance to that of 200 A.D. The integrated Mediterranean world had fractured into regional polities. Economic life reoriented toward local production and land-based authority. And yet, the legacy of silk persisted. Byzantine textiles would influence medieval art and court culture. Islamic trade networks would carry silk across continents. Italian merchants would revive long-distance commerce. The story of silk did not end with Rome's fall. It evolved. But the Western Empire's experience stands as a reminder that economic power is not only about consumption or prestige, it is about control of resources, production, currency, and trade routes. Rome once believed that because silk flowed into its markets, it commanded the world. In reality, it was tethered to distant looms. When its treasury weakened and its frontiers strained, that tether became visible, and by then it was too late to reverse the course. To fully understand how a luxury commodity could intersect with imperial decline, we must look beyond silk as fabric and examine silk as infrastructure. Not physical infrastructure like roads or aqueducts, but economic infrastructure, the web of agreements, routes, credit arrangements, and political accommodations that allowed a product to travel from East Asia to the Mediterranean. The Silk Road was not a single highway stretching unbroken across Eurasia. It was a shifting mosaic of caravan paths, oasis cities, mountain crossings, and maritime corridors. Silk leaving China passed through the Hexi Corridor, across Central Asian kingdoms such as Khotan and Sogdia, through Persian-controlled territories, and eventually into Roman Syria or Egypt. At every transfer point, tolls and markups accumulated. Rome did not control this chain. It participated in the final stage of it. That distinction matters. An empire that controls the full supply chain of a strategic good can shape prices, regulate output, and capture value internally. An empire that controls only the final consumer market pays whatever price intermediaries demand. Rome belonged to the second category. Persia understood this well. The Sassanid Empire, rising in the 3rd century, consolidated authority over Mesopotamia and key overland routes. Persian merchants purchased silk from Central Asian traders and resold it westward at premiums. The geopolitical rivalry between Rome and Persia thus overlapped with economic interdependence. Even during periods of war, some trade persisted because demand remained. This interdependence produced vulnerability. If Persian authorities restricted trade or increased tariffs, Roman access tightened. Prices rose. Gold flowed outward more rapidly. Roman diplomatic efforts to bypass Persian intermediaries achieved little. Maritime trade through the Red Sea connected Rome to India, and from there indirectly to Southeast Asia, but direct access to Chinese silk remained elusive. The technological secret of sericulture was fiercely protected. Rome could import finished silk, but it could not produce raw thread. Meanwhile, the Roman fiscal system relied heavily on predictable gold flows. Gold aurae and later solidi underpinned high-level transactions, military salaries, imperial construction, diplomatic payments. When gold left the empire through trade and did not return, it reduced liquidity at the top of the system. This reduction was gradual, not catastrophic. For generations, the outflow was manageable because conquest and mining supplemented reserves. But once territorial expansion halted and internal crises intensified, the long-term effects became apparent. The 3rd century's currency debasement was not purely the result of silk trade, but the trade deficit contributed to metal scarcity. Silver content in the denarius fell from near purity under Augustus to negligible levels by the mid-3rd century. Inflation followed. Price controls under Diocletian were an attempt to stabilize markets in an environment where coinage no longer matched its nominal value. Silk appeared explicitly in Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, and with high ceilings set for different grades of imported textiles. The state recognized silk as both valuable and inflation-sensitive. Its inclusion in the edict indicates how deeply embedded it had become in the Roman economy. By the 4th century, Constantine's reforms restored confidence through the gold solidus, which maintained consistent purity. Yet even this reform could not reverse structural imbalances in the western provinces. The East, closer to major trade arteries, accumulated gold more effectively. Constantinople became the focal point of imperial finance. The West's economic geography was less favorable. Its wealth derived more heavily from agriculture than from commercial transit. As urban networks weakened and tax collection faltered, bullion reserves thinned further. When the Vandals seized North Africa in 439, they captured not only fertile land, but also maritime trade hubs. Carthage had been a crucial revenue source. Its loss deprived the Western Empire of grain shipments and tax income. The treasury shrank again. Military costs, however, did not shrink proportionally. Frontier pressures along the Rhine and Danube persisted. Gothic and Hunnic incursions required response. Without sufficient gold to pay professional troops, Western rulers increasingly relied on federate arrangements, granting land in exchange for service. This marked a profound structural change. Under the classical imperial model, Loyalty was tied to salary and centralized authority. Under the federate model, loyalty was negotiated and contingent. Military commanders held leverage. By 476, when Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, the imperial office in the west had become largely symbolic. The fiscal backbone necessary to sustain it had eroded. In contrast, the Eastern Empire retained stronger fiscal mechanisms. Its proximity to trade routes allowed it to tax goods entering through Syria and Egypt. Its eventual control of silk production through Justinian's initiative further strengthened internal revenue streams. Silk workshops became state-controlled assets, generating value rather than draining metal. This divergence underscores a central economic lesson. Access to goods is not equivalent to control over production. Rome had access to silk for centuries, but it lacked control. Byzantium, by securing sericulture, internalized production and shifted leverage in its favor. The Western Empire never made that transition. By the time silk production reached the Mediterranean, the West had already fragmented into successor kingdoms. The transformation from global trade dominance to localized agrarian economies did not occur because Europeans suddenly lost interest in commerce. It occurred because the fiscal and logistical systems required to sustain long-distance exchange had weakened beyond repair. Silk's role in this story is emblematic. It represents how a high-value import, when sustained through structural deficit, can erode financial resilience over time. It reveals how prestige consumption can coexist with declining solvency. And it illustrates how geopolitical leverage often rests on control of supply chains. When the Western Empire fell, it left behind roads, laws, and cultural memory. But it did not leave behind the integrated fiscal machinery that had once unified the Mediterranean. And that machinery had depended on metal, and for centuries metal had flowed eastward in exchange for silk. When historians debate the fall of Rome, they often focus on dramatic episodes. The sack of Rome in 410, the crossing of the Rhine in 406, the deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476. Yet economic decline rarely announces itself through singular events. It manifests through erosion, thinning reserves, shrinking trade, fading coinage, diminishing trust in institutions. By the time the Western Empire reached the 5th century, its fiscal architecture had been under pressure for generations. Silk, as a long-term trade imbalance, was not a sudden shock, but a steady drain that reduced flexibility at critical moments. To appreciate how reduced flexibility can become fatal, consider the empire's military commitments. The Roman army in the 4th and 5th centuries was vast, divided into frontier troops, limitanae, and mobile field armies, comitatenses. Maintaining these forces required enormous resources: pay, equipment, provisions, transport. Under Diocletian and Constantine, military spending consumed a substantial portion of state revenue. As long as taxation in coin remained reliable, this system functioned. But when coinage grew scarce and territories were lost, the revenue-to-expenditure ratio deteriorated. The loss of Britain in the early 5th century removed not only a province, but also its tax contribution. The Visigothic settlement in Aquitaine in 418 signaled another concession of fiscal territory. The capture of Carthage by the Vandals in 439 was perhaps the most devastating financial blow. North Africa had supplied grain and tax revenue critical to the Western treasury. Its loss further constricted bullion flow. At this point, the Western Empire faced a compounding problem: declining income and persistent expenses. Debasement had already weakened currency confidence in earlier centuries. While Constantine's gold solidus restored stability at the imperial level, the distribution of gold was uneven. Increasingly, the Eastern Empire accumulated reserves while the West struggled to retain them. The silk trade must be viewed within this broader metallic economy. For centuries, gold and silver had left Roman territory to pay for Eastern luxuries. Even if conquest and mining initially compensated for the outflow, by the 4th century, those supplementary sources had diminished. The net effect was reduced metallic depth. Metallic depth, the stock of precious metal available for coinage, determines how resilient a currency system can be under stress. When depth is shallow, shocks are harder to absorb. In the Western Empire, shocks accumulated rapidly. Civil wars disrupted tax collection. Barbarian incursions damaged agricultural production. Trade routes were threatened. Each disruption reduced revenue while military costs remained high. By contrast, the Eastern Empire retained control over Egypt, whose agricultural productivity underpinned Constantinople's grain supply and tax base. Its geographic position allowed it to mediate trade between the Mediterranean and Asia. When Justinian later secured the secret of sericulture, the East further strengthened its economic autonomy. The West had no such strategic breakthrough. Instead, economic adaptation took the form of localization. As coin became less central, large estates functioned as microeconomies. Peasants provided labor and produced directly to landowners. Exchange occurred through obligation rather than cash. Political authority became embedded in landholding patterns. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor was it uniform. Italy, under Theodoric the Ostrogoth, maintained a degree of Roman administrative continuity. Some urban life persisted. Yet the integrated, monetized imperial economy of the High Empire did not survive intact. Silk's story illustrates how long-distance trade can simultaneously signal prosperity and vulnerability. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, Rome's ability to import silk demonstrated its global reach. By the 5th century, continued silk consumption in the West signaled something different, a lingering attachment to prestige goods despite fiscal fragility. One can imagine an aristocrat in Ravenna wearing imported silk while tax revenues declined and Federate troops negotiated land settlements. The symbol endured, but the foundation weakened. This disjunction between appearance and solvency is not unique to Rome. History shows repeatedly that powerful states may sustain outward displays of wealth even as structural deficits accumulate. The Western Roman Empire lacked the capacity to correct its long-term trade imbalance once expansion ceased. It lacked access to the origin of silk production. It lacked the geographic advantage that Constantinople possessed, and it lacked the metallic reserves necessary to cushion prolonged instability. When political collapse finally arrived, it was less an explosion than a fading. Authority devolved into regional kingdoms. The imperial title in the West disappeared, though Roman identity persisted culturally and legally. In the centuries that followed, Western Europe reorganized itself around land-based hierarchies. Manorial estates structured agricultural production. Fealty replaced salary as the basis of military obligation. Coinage continued, but on smaller scales. Long-distance trade revived slowly and unevenly. Silk would return to Western Europe in new forms, mediated by Byzantine and later Islamic networks, and eventually produced in Italian workshops. But the integrated imperial economy that had once funneled gold eastward was gone. The lesson embedded in this transformation is subtle but powerful. Economic dependency does not destroy an empire in isolation. It constrains options, it narrows margins, it reduces resilience. When combined with military strain, political fragmentation, and demographic shock, constrained options can become fatal. The Western Roman Empire's long engagement with the silk trade reveals how deeply interconnected the ancient world was. It also reveals how interconnection can generate imbalance. A shimmering fabric woven in distant mulberry groves became, over centuries, a thread woven into the fiscal fabric of Rome itself. When that fiscal fabric frayed, the empire could not hold. By the 6th and 7th centuries, the Mediterranean world no longer revolved around Rome, yet the economic currents that had contributed to the Western Empire's decline continued to reshape Eurasia. The vacuum left by the West's collapse did not remain empty. New powers rose into the spaces once held by Roman administration, and control of trade routes, including silk, became central to their ascent. The Byzantine Empire, inheritor of the eastern half of Rome, stood at the crossroads of this transformation. With Constantinople as its capital, it commanded access between Europe and Asia. After securing the secret of sericulture, Byzantium developed an internal silk industry that became a pillar of its economy and diplomacy. Imperial workshops produced textiles of extraordinary craftsmanship, or often woven with gold thread and intricate Christian iconography. These silks were not merely garments, they were political instruments. Byzantine emperors distributed silk strategically to foreign rulers, Franks, Lombards, Slavs, reinforcing alliances and projecting prestige. The empire's control over production allowed it to regulate supply and maintain high value. Instead of hemorrhaging gold, Byzantium could capture profit margins internally. This shift underscores the fundamental economic divergence between East and West. Where the Western Empire had consumed silk without controlling its source, the Eastern Empire integrated production into its state apparatus. Meanwhile, another transformative force emerged in the 7th century: the rapid expansion of the Islamic Caliphate. Arab conquests swept across Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and Persia. Within decades, territories that had once been Roman or Sassanid were unified under new rule. This development reconfigured trade networks once again. Islamic authorities inherited key Silk Road segments and maritime routes in the Indian Ocean. Rather than dismantle existing trade systems, they integrated and expanded them. Cities such as Baghdad and Damascus became vibrant commercial centers. Silk, spices, and precious goods continued to flow westward, but now through Islamic intermediaries. For Western Europe, this meant that access to Eastern luxuries depended increasingly on Muslim-controlled networks or Byzantine mediation. The Western successor kingdoms, still economically localized, lacked the naval and commercial infrastructure to compete directly. The Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne in the 8th and 9th centuries attempted to revive aspects of Roman governance, but its economy remained largely agrarian. Coinage reforms under Charlemagne standardized silver pennies, yet gold coinage was rare in Western Europe during this period. Gold remained concentrated in Byzantium and Islamic territories. The absence of abundant gold in the early medieval West reflects the long-term consequences of earlier outflows and the loss of integrated trade dominance. Western rulers operated within tighter fiscal constraints, relying on land and silver rather than gold reserves. It was not until the 11th and 12th centuries, with the revival of Mediterranean commerce led by Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa, that Western Europe re-entered large-scale luxury trade. These maritime republics negotiated trade agreements with Byzantine and Islamic authorities, importing silk and other Eastern goods into European markets. Eventually, silk production itself migrated westward. Italian cities like Lucca and Venice developed their own silk industries, drawing on techniques transmitted through centuries of contact. And this marked a structural change similar to what Byzantium had achieved earlier. Control over production reduced dependency. But this renaissance occurred hundreds of years after the Western Roman Empire's collapse. Looking back across this long arc, the silk trade illustrates the interplay between consumption, control, and resilience. The Western Empire consumed without producing. It paid with precious metals drawn from conquest and taxation. When those sources dwindled, it lacked the capacity to pivot. The Eastern Empire pivoted. By acquiring sericulture, it transformed silk from a drain into an asset. Islamic polities integrated trade routes into expansive commercial networks, capturing value across continents. Western Europe, initially marginalized, eventually rebuilt through maritime enterprise and domestic production. The difference lay not in desire, all regions valued silk, but in structural position. Rome's early dominance in the Mediterranean did not guarantee control over Eurasian supply chains. The Silk Road was never Roman territory. It was a network beyond imperial reach. Rome participated at its western terminus, paying gold for goods shaped by distant labor. In times of abundance, this arrangement appeared sustainable. In times of constraint, it revealed vulnerability. The Western Roman Empire's fiscal fragility in the 5th century cannot be reduced to silk alone. Yet silk provides a lens through which broader economic patterns become visible. It shows how sustained trade deficits, even when associated with luxury goods, can reduce strategic flexibility. When invasions came and provinces were lost, the West lacked reserves. Its treasury had been thinned not only by military expenditure, but by centuries of bullion export. It could not raise new armies easily. It could not repair infrastructure rapidly. It could not stabilize currency without debasement. The empire that had once unified the Mediterranean became a patchwork of kingdoms. Silk did not vanish from Europe, but its meaning shifted. In Byzantium, it symbolized imperial continuity. In Islamic courts, it signaled cosmopolitan wealth. In Western Europe, it became an imported marvel, rare and prestigious. The fabric endured. The empire that had once paid dearly for it did not. By the High Middle Ages, Europe had begun to reassemble itself into a more interconnected world. But it did so under very different economic foundations than those that had sustained the Roman Empire. The centralized gold-backed fiscal machine of Rome did not return. Instead, Western Europe rebuilt through incremental commercial revival, maritime expansion, and gradual control over production, lessons learned, perhaps unconsciously, from centuries of dependency. To appreciate the full arc of transformation, it is necessary to compare the Roman model of global consumption with the medieval model of regional production. Rome, at its height, operated as a consumption-driven superpower. Its elite demanded goods from across Eurasia. Its political identity was reinforced by visible luxury. Silk was emblematic of that identity. The empire's ability to draw in distant goods reinforced its claim to universality. But the Roman model relied heavily on precious metal liquidity. And gold and silver were extracted through conquest, mining, and taxation, then circulated outward to pay for imports. When expansion ceased and mining yields declined, this outward flow became more difficult to sustain. In contrast, medieval Western Europe, particularly from the 11th century onward, developed a more diversified production base. Italian city-states established silk-weaving industries domestically, reducing reliance on Byzantine imports. Merchant guilds formed networks of credit that did not rely exclusively on bullion transfers. Banking innovations in Florence and other cities introduced financial instruments that could facilitate trade without immediate physical movement of gold. This evolution reveals something important. The vulnerability of Rome was not merely that it imported silk, but that it did so within a rigid metallic monetary system that offered limited flexibility once reserves declined. During the early empire, Rome could afford the outflow because conquest replenished reserves. Under Trajan, the annexation of Dacia brought vast quantities of gold into the treasury. But conquest as an economic strategy is finite. Once the empire reached its natural geographic limits, further territorial gains were costly and politically unstable. At that point, Rome faced a structural choice: reduce luxury imports or develop domestic substitutes. It did neither. Cultural demand for silk persisted, and technological barriers prevented local production. The Byzantine solution in the 6th century, acquiring sericulture, represented the type of adaptation the Western Empire never achieved. By internalizing silk production, Byzantium shifted from trade deficit to trade leverage. Western Europe would only replicate such adaptation centuries later. Meanwhile, the early medieval West functioned within tight resource constraints. Gold coinage was scarce, and silver dominated Western mints for much of the period. Economic life was land-centered, authority was dispersed. While this system lacked the scale and sophistication of the Roman Empire, it was also less dependent on distant supply chains. Ironically, the localized medieval economy was more insulated from global shocks, precisely because it was less globally integrated. As maritime trade revived in the Mediterranean during the Crusades and beyond, Western merchants reconnected with Eastern markets. Silk again flowed into Europe in significant quantities. Yet this time, Western producers increasingly mastered the craft themselves. By the 13th century, Italian silk industries were thriving. The technological secret that had once been guarded in China and later monopolized in Byzantium was now diffused across Europe. The long arc from Roman dependency to medieval production illustrates a key economic principle. Resilience grows when control over critical goods is diversified and internalized. Rome's fatal vulnerability was not desire, but dependency without control. When gold flowed eastward for centuries, it enriched trading partners and intermediaries. It also reduced Rome's metallic cushion. When crises struck, plagues, invasions, civil wars, the Western Empire lacked the depth to absorb them. The Eastern Empire, by contrast, retained stronger fiscal coherence. Its control of Egypt and Syria sustained agricultural and commercial revenue. Its acquisition of silk production added strategic value. Though Byzantium would face its own near collapse in later centuries, it endured far longer than its Western counterpart. By 1453, when Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans, it had survived nearly 1,000 years beyond the fall of Rome in the West. Silk did not single-handedly decide these outcomes, but it symbolized the divergent paths. In Rome, silk was an imported emblem of status that drained bullion. In Byzantium, silk was a state-controlled industry that generated leverage. In medieval Western Europe, silk became a domesticated craft integrated into emerging capitalist systems. The Western Roman Empire's collapse marked the end of an era of Mediterranean unification. But it also initiated a long process of economic reconfiguration. Trade networks would return, urban centers would revive, banking would evolve, production would diversify. Yet the lesson embedded in Rome's experience remained relevant. An empire can dominate militarily and culturally while remaining economically dependent on distant producers. It can appear wealthy while quietly exporting the very resources that sustain its power. It can mistake access for control. Silk shimmered in Roman courts for centuries. It signaled refinement, global reach, and imperial magnificence. But behind its shimmer lay a steady transfer of precious metal that, over time, weakened fiscal resilience. When the Western Empire finally fragmented, it did so in a world where control over trade routes and production had shifted elsewhere. The fabric survived. The system that paid for it did not. By the time Western Europe began to recover commercially in the 11th and 12th centuries, the memory of Rome's integrated economy had faded into legend. Yet the structural consequences of its collapse still shaped the continent. The political map was fragmented. Authority was layered and negotiated. Economic systems were cautious, regional, and land-based. It is within this contrast between Roman scale and medieval localization that the long shadow of the silk trade becomes clearest. Rome's imperial economy had operated at a scale that required constant inflows of value. Its cities were massive consumers. Its armies were professional and salaried. Its administration was centralized and bureaucratic. This model demanded liquidity. It demanded gold. When gold flowed outward in exchange for silk and other Eastern luxuries, it did not immediately threaten the system because other inflows compensated. Conquest, tribute, and mining replenished reserves. But as those compensatory streams narrowed, the luxury drain remained. A crucial shift occurred when expansion ended. An empire that ceases to grow must live within its means. Rome had not recalibrated its consumption to match its post-expansion reality. Luxury demand persisted even as territorial revenue plateaued. This is not a moral argument about decadence. It is an economic observation about balance. Trade imbalances can persist for decades if offset by new wealth generation. Remove that offset, and structural weakness appears. By the late 4th and 5th centuries, the Western Empire faced rising defense costs without proportional revenue growth. The Rhine and Danube frontiers required constant vigilance. The Hunnic migrations destabilized Central Europe. Civil conflicts drained resources. Each crisis demanded gold. Gold, however, had been steadily exported eastward for generations. It would be simplistic to claim that silk alone bankrupted the West. Yet silk exemplified the kind of high-value import that extracted bullion without strengthening domestic production. Rome did not build a silk industry. It did not gain technical knowledge. It did not diversify supply sources. It paid and consumed. When bullion reserves declined, debasement became the instrument of survival. But debasement eroded trust in currency. Trust, once weakened, is difficult to restore. Diocletian's price edict could not legislate confidence. Only credible metallic backing could. Constantine's gold solidus restored credibility in the East, but the West lacked equal structural support. As gold gravitated toward Constantinople and eastern provinces, Western liquidity shrank. When provinces were lost, Britain, much of Gaul, North Africa, the tax base shrank further. The Western treasury did not collapse overnight. It narrowed, it strained, it improvised. Federate agreements were fiscal compromises. Instead of paying in coin, the state granted land. This shifted the military system from centralized payroll to negotiated settlement. Land became currency. The transformation of land into the primary medium of political exchange marked the beginning of medieval feudal patterns. It was not ideology but necessity that drove the change. When coin is scarce, property substitutes. The Roman world had once been urban and cash-driven. The medieval West became rural and estate-driven. The irony is striking. The empire that had once commanded the Mediterranean found itself unable to command the supply chain of a single luxury commodity. It could project force across continents, but could not produce silk thread. Byzantium's acquisition of sericulture revealed what Rome might have done had it possessed the stability and foresight to pursue technological autonomy earlier. But history rarely grants second chances at structural pivots. The Western Empire's fall was not caused by silk alone, yet silk illuminates the broader dynamic of dependency. It shows how a superpower can become entangled in trade relationships that appear harmless during prosperity but constraining during decline. The medieval recovery of Western Europe eventually followed a different path. Italian city-states learned to integrate production and trade. Banking innovations reduced reliance on physical bullion transfers. Credit instruments allowed merchants to settle accounts across distances without transporting large quantities of gold. This financial flexibility did not exist in classical Rome. Its monetary system was materially grounded. Coins were metal, not paper or ledger entries. When metal left, wealth left. In the end, the Western Roman Empire did not fall because silk was beautiful. It fell because its economic structure could not indefinitely sustain outward flows of precious metal while internal pressures mounted. Silk was one strand in a web of vulnerabilities. Military overextension, political fragmentation, demographic decline, and external invasions all contributed. But silk highlights how global trade, even in antiquity, could shape imperial destiny. An empire may dominate its immediate neighbors while remaining economically dependent on distant producers. If it cannot control critical supply chains, it trades leverage for luxury. Rome traded gold for silk. When gold grew scarce, leverage faded. The empire's decline was gradual, layered, and complex. Yet woven through its story is a lesson about balance, control, and resilience. The thread that shimmered in imperial halls was also the thread that revealed structural strain. As we approach the final stage of this long arc, the story of silk and Rome becomes less about fabric and more about systems. What ultimately unraveled in the West was not simply political authority, but a model of economic organization that depended on sustained flows of precious metal and centralized control over vast territories. The Roman Empire at its height had solved the logistical problem of scale. It unified diverse provinces under common taxation, law, and currency. It built infrastructure that allowed goods and armies to move efficiently. It created a shared monetary language in gold and silver coinage. This system was resilient when expansion and conquest replenished resources, but scale magnifies vulnerability as well as strength. A small kingdom can survive with limited trade and localized production. A transcontinental empire cannot. Its administrative machinery requires constant input. Roads must be maintained, fortresses must be staffed. Grain must be transported, salaries must be paid. Silk was a small part of this machinery in absolute economic volume compared to grain or military expenditure, yet it symbolized a broader pattern. The willingness to export finite bullion in exchange for goods that enhanced prestige but did not enhance productive capacity. Rome did not import silk machinery. It did not import sericulture knowledge. It imported finished textiles. The bullion that paid for those textiles did not circulate back through Roman markets. It strengthened Eastern economies and intermediary states. Over centuries, this outward flow reduced Rome's margin for error. By the 5th century, the Western Empire faced simultaneous pressures: Germanic migrations destabilizing borders, internal political fragmentation, demographic strain from plagues, and shrinking tax bases. In a more financially elastic system, such pressures might have been absorbed. In Rome's constrained metallic economy, they proved cumulative. The loss of North Africa in 439 was a tipping point, not because Africa alone defined imperial survival, but because it removed a critical source of both grain and gold revenue. The Vandals controlled Carthage's ports, disrupting Mediterranean trade. Western rulers lacked the naval capacity and fiscal strength to reclaim it decisively. At this stage, silk still flowed into elite wardrobes, but the empire that consumed it was hollowing out. The Eastern Empire, by contrast, demonstrated adaptive capacity. Justinian's acquisition of silkworm eggs was not merely an act of espionage, it was a strategic economic pivot. By domesticating silk production, Byzantium reduced a chronic trade imbalance. It shifted from dependency to control. The Western Empire never executed such a pivot. By the time sericulture reached Mediterranean soil, the West had already fragmented into post-Roman kingdoms. Those kingdoms lacked the centralized administrative coherence to monopolize and leverage silk production in the way Byzantium did. The transformation of Western Europe into a patchwork of agrarian polities was not solely the result of invasion. It was the logical outcome of a system that could no longer sustain imperial scale. Without abundant coinage, military organization changed. Without integrated trade networks, urban life contracted. Without centralized fiscal authority, land replaced salary as the currency of power. This was not a descent into chaos, but a reconfiguration. The early medieval world developed its own forms of order. Feudal bonds replaced imperial bureaucracy. Monasteries preserved literacy. Agricultural innovation gradually improved productivity. Yet the Mediterranean was no longer a Roman lake. It became a contested arena among Byzantines, Islamic caliphates, and later, emerging European maritime powers. Silk continued to travel across this world. It appeared in Byzantine courts, Abbasid palaces, and eventually Italian workshops. Its route shifted, but its allure endured. The difference lay in who controlled its production and trade. Rome had been a consumer at the end of a long chain. Byzantium became a producer. Islamic polities became intermediaries and innovators. Medieval Europe eventually became a manufacturer. Control over production translated into fiscal resilience. Dependency translated into vulnerability. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was a multifaceted process shaped by geography, politics, disease, and war. Yet the silk trade provides a window into how economic structures underpin political stability. It shows how long-term trade deficits, even when tied to luxury goods, can weaken metallic reserves in a pre-credit economy. It shows how debasement, while temporarily easing shortages, undermines trust. It shows how the inability to pivot technologically can lock a state into disadvantage. Most of all, it shows that prestige can obscure imbalance. In its golden age, Rome saw silk as proof of its dominance over a connected world. In its twilight, that same silk revealed dependence on distant producers and intermediaries. An empire that once commanded roads from Britain to Mesopotamia could not command the mulberry groves of China. When the pressures of the 5th century mounted, the Western treasury lacked the depth to respond effectively. The empire did not collapse because silk existed. It collapsed because the system that paid for silk could no longer sustain itself. In the end, the story of how a medieval silk monopoly helped bankrupt the Western Roman Empire is not really about fabric at all. It is about flow, the flow of metal, the flow of goods, the flow of leverage across continents. For centuries, Rome stood at the center of the Mediterranean world and believed that position guaranteed control. Its armies were unmatched, its roads were unparalleled, its currency was trusted from Britain to Syria. When silk arrived in Roman markets, shimmering and impossibly light, it seemed like yet another confirmation that the world bent toward Rome. But Rome did not control silk. It controlled only the last transaction. Every bolt of silk that passed through Roman hands carried with it a hidden exchange: gold, moving eastward into systems beyond Roman authority. As long as conquest replenished treasuries, this exchange appeared harmless. Spain's mines, Dacia's plunder, and provincial taxation kept the metallic reservoir deep. When expansion stopped, the arithmetic changed. An empire that exports bullion without equal return can survive for a time. It can debase coinage. It can impose price controls. It can raise taxes. It can seize assets. But over generations, a structural imbalance narrows its options. By the 3rd century, silver purity had collapsed. Inflation eroded confidence. Diocletian's price edict signaled desperation. Constantine's gold solidus restored stability in the east, but distribution of wealth was uneven. The Western Empire faced mounting military costs without expanding revenue. Then came territorial losses, Britain drifting away, Visigoths settled in Gaul, Vandals seizing North Africa. Each loss tightened the fiscal vice. Gold reserves thinned, payment shifted from coin to land, authority fragmented. Silk continued to shimmer in elite wardrobes, but it could no longer conceal the shrinking treasury behind it. When the final Western emperor was deposed in 476, there was no dramatic bankruptcy declaration. The system had already hollowed out. Coin circulation had diminished in many regions. Urban centers had contracted. Military loyalty had become negotiable. Meanwhile, Constantinople endured. The Eastern Empire pivoted. It secured sericulture. It internalized silk production. It converted dependency into leverage. Byzantine workshops generated value rather than draining it. Gold solidi remained trusted across Eurasia for centuries after the West fell. The contrast is stark. Rome consumed silk as a luxury. Byzantium produced silk as strategy. The Western Empire's collapse was never monocausal. Plagues reduced populations, civil wars fractured authority, invasions strained defenses, but underlying these events was a question of resilience. Resilience depends on control over revenue streams, control over production, control over supply chains. Rome possessed roads, laws, and legions, but it did not possess the mulberry groves that fed silkworms thousands of miles away. It did not possess the knowledge to spin thread from cocoons. It did not possess the geopolitical leverage over Persian intermediaries who marked up every transaction. In a metallic monetary system, every ounce of gold exported mattered. Every long-term imbalance narrowed strategic flexibility. The silk trade did not alone topple the Western Empire, but it exemplified how an empire can bleed quietly through prestige consumption, especially when expansion ceases and structural adaptation fails. When we look at the medieval world that followed, we see a Europe less integrated but also less globally dependent. Economic life localized. Land replaced coin as the core of power. Over time, Western Europe rebuilt commercial networks, developed banking innovations, and mastered silk production itself. The lesson is enduring. A superpower may dominate militarily and culturally while remaining economically dependent. It may mistake access for control. It may believe that participation in a global network equals mastery of it. Tin Rome believed silk proved its supremacy. In reality, silk revealed its vulnerability. The Western Roman Empire did not fall because of softness or decadence. It fell because the fiscal machinery required to sustain imperial scale weakened beyond recovery. Luxury imports were one strand in that weakening, a strand that carried gold eastward year after year. When crises converged in the 5th century, the Western treasury lacked the depth to respond decisively. Political fragmentation followed economic contraction, and so a fabric woven in distant China became part of a story that ended in Ravenna and Rome. not through spectacle, but through slow arithmetic. The map of Europe was rewritten not by silk alone, but silk traced the contours of the change. It connected mulberry trees in Asia to melting statues in Rome. It connected Persian toll roads to unpaid legions. It connected imperial vanity to fiscal strain. And in that connection lies the deeper truth. Empires are not only defeated at their borders, they are also weakened in their ledgers. The Western Roman Empire ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. It conquered, codified, and constructed. Yet in the quiet exchange of gold for silk, we glimpse the limits of its power, because even the mightiest empire cannot spend what it does not ultimately control. And Rome, for all its glory, never controlled the thread that helped unravel it.